He thought she was just another careless mum at the park. But when she spoke, his face went pale and his pride shattered. The sun hung low in the sky, casting soft golden light across the manicured lawns and winding pathways of Crestwood Park. It was one of those rare afternoons where time seemed to pause, warm, quiet, and just breezy enough to rustle the leaves. Above, without disturbing the peace below, the rhythmic chirping of cicadas blended with the distant laughter of children. Families lounged on blankets, strollers rolled lazily by, and the smell of freshly mowed grass lingered in the air like an old, familiar lullaby. Dan sat alone on a wooden bench near the edge of the playground, his legs crossed neatly at the ankle, a well-worn paperback resting in his lap. The spine was cracked, the pages yellowed, his wire-rimmed glasses slid slightly down his nose, but he didn't bother pushing them up. He wasn't really reading anymore. Instead, his attention had shifted to a little boy on the playground. The boy couldn't have been more than 6, barefoot, with scruffy brown curls and dirt-smudged cheeks. He darted between the slide and the climbing wall like a whirlwind of energy. He held a stick in one hand, a magic sword. By the way he wielded it and narrated his own adventures in a booming theatrical voice. The lava's coming. Quick, climb the volcano before it melts your shoes. I'm the last dragon. Rider only, I can save the kingdom. His voice rose and fell with dramatic intensity, drawing a few glances from other parkgoers. Some smiled, others didn't. Dan was firmly in the latter camp. He let out a small huff, adjusting his glasses and shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for no one to hear. No shoes, yelling like a maniac. Where is his mother? A few yards away, seated on a picnic blanket near the trees. A woman watched the boy with a quiet sort of attention. She was in her mid-30s, casually dressed in jeans and a light cardigan, her curly hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. Her expression was serene, soft but alert. She didn't have her phone out. She wasn't distracted. She simply watched. Dan squinted at her, then back at the boy. The child had now climbed to the top of a jungle gym, arms stretched wide like wings. I can fly. I can. Dan flinched slightly as the boy leaped down, landing on his feet in the sand with a loud thud, laughing breathlessly. The older man's eyebrows furrowed deeper. That's dangerous, he thought. What if he twists an ankle? Or worse? She just sat there. She didn't even flinch. He glanced around, half expecting someone else to intervene, but no one did. The park flowed on. Oblivious. Dan shifted uncomfortably. He had taught middle school English for nearly 3 decades before retiring 5 years ago. Discipline, structure, routine, those had been his tools, and he believed in them the way others believed in gravity. Children needed boundaries. They needed rules. That's how they learned. To him, watching a child run barefoot in a public park, shouting fantasy stories into the open air, seemed undisciplined, borderline irresponsible. He closed his book and rested it on his knee. Still, watching the boy, his eyes darted again to the woman under the tree. Her posture hadn't changed, calm, composed. She even looked like she was smiling. Don sighed, louder this time. The boy, Milo, though Don didn't know his name yet, was now lying flat in the grass, arms stretched above his head, staring up at the sky. His stick sword lay forgotten beside him. Dan narrowed his eyes. Must be nice to let a kid do whatever he wants, he muttered. Doesn't she care how he looks? How loud he's being? A few other children ran by, some shrieking, some laughing, but none as loud or animated as Milo. Dan's thoughts, already stirred, began to form into something more pointed. This wasn't just free play. This was lack of control, lack of parenting, and she, whoever she was, needed to hear it. He stared at her again, this time longer. Something about her poise bothered him, as if she were too relaxed, too confident in her approach, as if she thought she knew better. The boy stood again, now turning in circles with his arms out like airplane wings, singing softly to himself. Don shook his head and muttered once more. No structure, no shoes, no discipline. Kids these days don't stand a chance. And with that, he stood up slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his slacks. He tucked his book under one arm and adjusted the collar of his polo shirt. He had something to say. He started walking toward her, each step small but certain, unaware that the conversation he was about to start would not go the way he expected. Not at all. Don made his way across the grass, the crunch of gravel underfoot, muted by the soft murmur of the afternoon breeze. As he neared the blanket where the woman sat, he cleared his throat, not too loudly, but deliberately enough to signal his presence. She looked up with a gentle expression. Her eyes were warm, almost amused, as if she'd known he'd be coming. "Excuse me," Miss Dan began, his voice measured and polite, the way he used to speak to parents during difficult teacher conferences. "I don't mean to offend, but you might want to keep a closer eye. He's well a bit wild, don't you think?" He nodded toward the boy, who was now crouched behind a bush, whispering something about treasure maps and secret missions. A moment later, Milo sprang out again, stick in hand, yelling triumphantly about discovering the buried sword of King Roderick. Dan winced. The woman tilted her head slightly. "He's just playing," she said, her voice calm light, no hint of offense, just a quiet certainty. "He's having a good time." Don blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. "Well," he continued, shifting his weight, "sure, play is important, but there's a difference between imagination and ... chaos." He chuckled softly, trying to mask his irritation with charm. "Back in my day, if we'd run around shouting like that, our mothers would have had us inside washing dishes in a heartbeat." Ava didn't react immediately. Her gaze drifted back to her son, who was now climbing onto a low branch, balancing like a tightrope walker. She didn't flinch when he wobbled. She didn't call out. Dan did. "Whoa, careful there," he called, stepping instinctively forward. Ava raised a hand slow. "Steady," Anne said. "He knows his limits." Dan stared at her. "He's 6. Children don't know limits. That's why they need rules." There it was, the line, the quiet implication that she wasn't doing enough, that she was too passive, too trusting, maybe too soft. He'd seen it before: mothers on their phones, dads letting kids throw tantrums in stores, parents too afraid to say no. It all led to the same place: unruly kids, poor grades, bad manners. And here was a prime example, right in front of him. Ava didn't take the bait. Instead, she smiled gently. "I appreciate your concern," she said. "Really, but he's not hurting anyone. He's just exploring." Dan folded his arms. "Exploring is fine, but letting a child shout at full volume, run barefoot, climb trees like a squirrel, that's not parenting, that's ... observation." Her eyebrows lifted just slightly, as if she'd caught something interesting in his tone. But still, she didn't push back. "It's not always easy," she said, her eyes now studying him more closely, letting them be themselves. "It takes patience." Dan scoffed. "And rules, structure. You give a child no boundaries, they grow up thinking the world will bend for them." His words were firm now, less suggestion, more judgment. The teacher in him was surfacing decades of beliefs, sharpened by years, of classrooms, reinforced by books and headlines, and what he liked to call common sense. Ava didn't bristle. She didn't scowl. She just let the silence linger for a moment, her hands resting loosely in her lap. Then, calmly, she said, "May I ask you something?" Dan blinked, caught slightly off guard. "Of course. What would you say if he was sitting still, quiet, reading a book, maybe even correcting other children?" Don nodded slightly. "I'd say he's well behaved, respectful, focused." She nodded too. "And would that mean he was happy?" The question hung in the air. Don hesitated, shifting again. "Well, sure, I suppose so. It would at least mean he was disciplined." Ava gave a soft, thoughtful smile. "My son loves dragons," she said. "He makes up entire worlds. Sometimes I can barely keep up, but I watch him closely. I listen to the things he's not saying out loud, and what I see is confidence, curiosity, joy." Dan glanced back at the boy, who was now sitting cross-legged under a tree, arranging pine cones and stones into a sort of circle. Still barefoot, still filthy, but ... focused. He frowned. "I just worry," Don said after a beat, the edge in his voice softening. "It's a rough world. Kids who don't learn boundaries early, they get eaten up out there." Ava looked at him, really. Looked, not as someone being judged, but as someone who understood what fear looked like when dressed up as advice. Her voice was low. "Even, I know the world can be rough," she said, "especially for boys like him. That's why I'm teaching him to trust himself before the world teaches him to doubt." Don fell quiet. He didn't have a response, not yet. Something about the way she said it, the precision in her tone, the calm, measured way she handled his interruption. He began to feel a slight uneasiness, because she was wrong, but because she might actually know more than he did, much more, and he hadn't realized it until now. Dan stood there, arms still crossed, as Ava's words lingered in the soft space between them. "That's why I'm teaching him to trust himself before the world teaches him to doubt." It echoed somewhere in him, quiet, inconvenient. He wasn't used to being on this side of the conversation. He cleared his throat. "I suppose I just come from a different time." Ava didn't flinch. Her gaze stayed warm, her presence unnervingly calm to calm. Perhaps for someone who had just been subtly accused of bad parenting. Then, gently, like she was opening a door instead of building a wall, she asked, "What makes you uncomfortable about the way he's playing?" Don blinked. The question landed like a soft punch, not accusatory, not mocking dash, just ... unexpected. He looked over at Milo, now crouching again beside the tree trunk, carefully balancing acorns on a large rock. His hands moved with a kind of silent purpose. His tongue peeked from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. "I don't know," Dan muttered. "He's loud. He talks to himself. He's messy, climbing, yelling. It looks like no one's in charge." Ava nodded slowly, like she was considering his words deeply, not to defend herself, but to understand him. "Do you think kids should all behave the same way?" she asked next. Don paused. He wasn't ready for that either. "Well, not exactly the same," he said, stumbling a bit. "But there should be standards, expectations. It's how society functions. If every child just did what they felt, we'd have chaos." Ava smiled, not mockingly, but in a way that suggested she'd heard that reasoning many times before. "And yet," she said, gesturing subtly toward the other families in the park, "if you look around, they're all playing differently. That little girl over there, she's been digging in the same spot for 20 minutes. I think she's trying to build a tunnel. And that boy with the green shirt, he's organizing leaves by color. No one told them to do those things, but they're learning all the same." Dan followed her gaze. He hadn't noticed the girl with the tunnel or the boy in the leaves. Now, he saw them clearly. She continued, her voice even softer. "Play is a child's first language. Through it, they process everything: emotion, space, relationships, problem-solving, even risk." Dan said nothing. Her words were deliberate, thoughtful. Each one seemed to press gently at the edges of his assumptions. She pointed discreetly at Milo, who had now begun stacking pine cones into a kind of wall. "Watch him for a moment. What do you see?" Dan sighed, folding his arms again, but this time with less conviction. "I see ... a mess," he offered. "And a boy who needs a bath." Ava chuckled. "Fair, but look again." Dan did. Milo was choosing his pine cones carefully, discarding the broken ones. He arranged them in a curve, adjusted their angles, stepped back, then shifted one slightly. "He's building something," Dan said, slowly. "He's experimenting," Ava replied. "Spatial awareness, trial and error. He's also calming himself down after a lot of movement, emotional regulation, through tactile grounding." Dan looked at her sideways. "You say that like you've studied it." "I have," she said, simply. There was something in the way she said it, neutral, unboastful, that made Dan pause. Studied it? He hadn't expected that. He had assumed, like so many times before, that he was the one bringing reason to emotion, that he was offering guidance where there was ... lack. But Ava's words weren't defensive. They were measured, purposeful, and it was beginning to feel like she was leading him somewhere he hadn't yet realized he needed to go. She glanced back at Milo. "He has a very active mind. If I ask him to sit still too long, he starts to chew on his sleeves, tap his fingers. You'd think he was misbehaving, but really, he's just trying to regulate input. When I let him play like this, his nervous system balances itself. His brain processes the day. He gets lighter." Dan's brow furrowed. "How do you know all that?" Ava turned to him, her expression unreadable, but kind. "I listen," she said, "and I watch, closely." For the first time, Dan had no ready response. No quote from his teaching days, no anecdote about how things used to be. Just the growing realization that there was far more happening here than met the eye. Wasn't passive. She wasn't negligent. She was intentional in a way that went far deeper than discipline charts or behavioral systems. And yet she still let her child be wild. Don felt the faint sting of embarrassment creep up his neck. He had come to correct her, to educate her, and now he was the one being quietly and thoroughly taught. He sat back down on the bench, the weight in his chest shifting. The boy stacked another pine cone. Don watched. Dan sat back down on the bench, his shoulders a little stiffer than before. The sun was lower now, casting longer shadows across the park. A breeze passed through the sycamore trees, rustling the leaves above, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, albeit quietly. He watched as Milo carefully placed a final pinnacone on top of his curved wall, stood back, and gave a small nod of satisfaction. The boy wasn't loud anymore. He wasn't running. He was just focused, content, almost meditative. Don adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Ava, still seated under the shade of the tree, glanced his way without shifting her body. Her posture hadn't changed in all this time, calm, alert, open. She reminded him of someone used to waiting, not passively, but patiently, watching the world unfold without needing to control it. He turned toward her, curiosity now outweighing his discomfort. "If you don't mind me asking," he said, his tone more tentative than before, "what do you do for a living?" Ava smiled, like she'd been expecting the question. She didn't answer right away. She looked out toward the playground, where a few other kids were beginning to head home, their parents calling from across the field. Then, softly, she replied, "I'm a child psychologist." Dan blinked a beat past. "You're what?" "I work with children and families, schools sometimes. I've done it for almost 15 years. He stared at her, stunned into silence. The breeze picked up again, as if punctuating the pause between them. Ava continued, still in that same even tone. "I've studied child development, behavioral therapy, play-based learning, trauma response, you name it." Dan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "I've worked with kids on 5 continents, she added. "Some in classrooms, some in crisis centers, some with plenty, and some with absolutely nothing." She paused, her gaze drifting back to Milo. "And some of the most anxious children I've ever met," she said quietly, "were the most well-behaved." Dan didn't move, didn't speak. His lips parted slightly, as if a response had formed but refused to leave. It hit him all at once. She wasn't just a mother watching her son. She wasn't just letting him play. She was observing, guiding, supporting, and she had been doing the same with him. Every question she'd asked, every measured response, the way she didn't flinch when he judged her, didn't argue when he pushed. She had seen him, coming long before he spoke. He had walked across the grass to correct a stranger. She had quietly invited him to reconsider everything. Don looked down at his book still closed in his lap. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the most informed person in the conversation. The certainty that had filled him earlier, the belief that he knew what good parenting looked like, had thinned into something fragile and uneasy. "I didn't know," he said at last, his voice softer now. "I just thought that I didn't care," Ava offered gently, finishing his sentence without blame. Dan hesitated, then nodded. "I understand," she said. "It happens more than you'd think." Her tone wasn't bitter. There was no sarcasm, no anger, just understanding. And that, somehow, made it worse. Don shifted uncomfortably on the bench, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess I made a lot of assumptions." Ava gave a small shrug. "We all do. That's part of being human." He looked at her again. She was still watching Milo, who was now offering his pinecone wall to another curious child nearby. Dan watched, too. The little boy smiled, explaining something with animated hand gestures. The other child nodded and joined him. No screaming, no chaos, just quiet collaboration. "He's a smart kid," Don murmured. Ava smiled. "He's figuring things out in his own way." Dan nodded, then sighed. "You know, back when I taught, we didn't talk about regulation or spatial learning. We talked about obedience, focus, results. If a kid stood up and started shouting about dragons, I'd send him to the hallway." Ava looked over at him, but said nothing. "And maybe I thought that meant I was helping," he added. She smiled kindly, not condescendingly. "Sometimes we mistake silence for success." Dan didn't respond. He just let that sentence sit in the air between them. She wasn't trying to shame him. She wasn't trying to win. She was just telling the truth, and he knew it. The park had started to thin out. A few birds chirped in the trees. The sound of distant car doors and sleepy toddlers filled the space where judgment had once sat. Dan stood slowly, brushing crumbs off his pants. "Well," he said, glancing toward her, "thank you for the education." Ava chuckled softly. Anytime. He began to walk away, then paused and looked back. You know, he said, for a moment there, I thought I was the one in control of the conversation. Ava smiled, eyes twinkling. I know, she said. Dan didn't walk far. He had taken just a few slow steps before something in him, quiet but insistent, urged him to stop. He turned slightly and looked back toward the bench. The breeze lifted again, carrying the smell of warm grass and faint laughter on the wind. Without quite knowing why, he returned to his seat. The wood creaked gently beneath him as he sat down. Ava remained where she was beneath the tree, her face calm, her attention still on her son. But Dan's gaze had changed. He looked at Milo again, really looked. The boy was now hunched over a small patch of dirt, carefully digging with a flat rock. Every movement was purposeful. His fingers brushed aside dry leaves to uncover something, an old bottle cap, maybe, or a beetle. His eyes sparkled with discovery, and Dan saw it, not the chaos, not the noise, but the wonder. He's imaginative, Dan thought. The words slipped out before he could stop them. He's imaginative, he murmured aloud, almost to himself. Ava turned, a soft smile forming. Thank you, she said, her voice full of quiet grace. Dan nodded slowly. He wasn't sure if he was thanking her, or her son, or both. The tight knot of judgment that had sat in his chest earlier had unraveled into something looser, lighter, a strange mix of regret, reflection, and relief. For the first time in a long while, he felt like a student again. Ava shifted slightly on the blanket, drawing one knee up as she watched Milo build a tiny moat around his piney cone wall using his fingers and a bit of water from a bottle. Then, without turning to look at Dan, she said, "Children are always more than what we see in a moment." Dan sat with that thought. He thought about all the kids he'd taught, how many he'd labeled too quickly. The fidgety ones, the loud ones, the dreamers, the ones who never turned in their homework but always had ideas bubbling just beneath the surface. He thought of how often he'd measured success by silence, by stillness, by order. How many of them just needed someone to see past that moment. He let out a soft breath, his eyes still on the boy. Milo laughed suddenly, having discovered something too. Small twigs he crossed over one another and planted in the dirt like a flag. He called it his dragon signal. Don found himself smiling. Across the park, the sun dipped lower behind the trees, setting the sky ablaze with hues of amber, rose, and lavender. The golden light kissed the tops of the swings, glinted off the monkey bars, and wrapped everything in a warm, forgiving glow. Children still played in pockets, laughing, tumbling, inventing games only they understood. Parents began gathering snacks and bags, their voices soft with the fatigue of a long afternoon. Don turned to Ava again, this time with something different in his expression. Not pride, not defensiveness, just openness. "Do you think," he asked quietly, "that it's too late for some of us to unlearn what we thought we knew?" Ava looked at him with such tenderness it startled him. "No," she said, "it's never too late. Children aren't the only ones still growing." The words reached a part of Dan he rarely let anyone see. The part that missed being useful, that missed making a difference, the part that feared maybe the world had moved on without him, and maybe, just maybe, it should have. He leaned back slightly on the bench, letting the sun warm his face. "I used to think parenting was all about control," he said after a while, "about shaping a child into something solid, predictable." Ava nodded, listening. "Now," he continued, "I wonder if it's more about holding space for who they already are." She smiled again. "Exactly." The two sat in companionable silence for a moment, just watching. Then Milo ran up to his mother, breathless and proud, holding a rock shaped like a heart. "For you, Mama," he said, placing it in her palm. Ava's face lit up as she kissed his forehead. "Thank you, baby." Milo turned to Dan and offered a shy wave. Dan raised his hand slowly, almost sheepishly, and returned it as the boy darted back to his dragon world. Dan chuckled to himself. "You've got a good kid," he said. "I know," Ava replied softly. "And someday, I hope he'll live in a world where no one doubts that at first glance." Dan looked at her, then down at the rock in her hand. The heart shape was rough, imperfect, but unmistakable. The sky deepened into dusk, colors fading into cooler blues. The park began to empty as parents called out to their children, and car doors began to open and shut in the distance. Dan stood once more. He felt older now, but not in a heavy way, in a wiser way, a humbled way. "I'll remember this," he said simply. Ava nodded. "So will he." The camera pans out as they part, Ava gathering her things, Milo skipping beside her, and Don walking slowly toward the path, the setting sun casting long shadows behind him. In the background, children's laughter still lingers, and for once, Dan hears the joy in it.